Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and once again, with our modest resources, we scoop the world because we have that arch scooper, the dean of the Western Press Corps in Moscow, who has more accumulated professional experience covering the Kremlin and uh, the extraordinarily opaque to Western eyes movements of the Russian body politic. The Western correspondents in these sad journalistic days combined. We have our old wonderful friend John Helmer back. Thank you, John. And to jump straight into it, we've had just a remarkable meeting. We've had Secretary of State Marco Rubio requesting speaking to the Russians. This in itself is remarkable. Usually, the Russians, over the past two administrations, have been hammering on the doors of Washington to get dialogues going and getting nothing but misunderstanding or contempt in return. All of a sudden, the door is swinging the other way. Why? John puts it in the context of the US election cycle and of very real electoral and policy fears that are finally breaking through the closed minds in Washington, D.C., in the State Department, and in the White House. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Pelly. I've never been called an arch scooper before. That sounds like
you see, come with us. There's always a first time.
Well, it sounds like the clown with the bucket and the broom behind the elephant. But in any case, let's put what happened, the Rubio-Lavrov meeting, for everybody else's understanding. What happened was that Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, called a meeting in Manila on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministry conference of ASEAN members. There's no doubt that Rubio called it. There's also no doubt, because Rubio himself admitted it, that the meeting only lasted 30 minutes. Now, 30 minutes is an extraordinarily short time. What happened is indicated by the Russian Foreign Ministry communique, which indicates that there was a detailed follow-up. I'm sorry, I'll skip reading the details because they're all available, plus the links to the original documents in the Dances with Bears story, which went up a couple of hours back. Basically, the Foreign Ministry of Russia issued a long communique, or at least a communique indicating there was a long discussion of multiple issues. Secretary Rubio did two things which are very unusual, and that indicates how significant what happened was, although that's not the way the US press or even the Russian press are picking it up. First of all, the meeting in a hotel called by Rubio allowed the press in for a 10-second photo op, but the State Department ordered the journalists not to ask questions, and the officials didn't answer them. Notwithstanding, you can hear on the tape two American reporters asking Rubio, was he going to ask Lavrov if Russia was assisting Iran to kill Americans, as blunt and as explicit as that. They were then ushered out of the room, and the meeting proceeded in secret, but only for 30 minutes. Then after the meeting, the cameras were rolling as Lavrov came out and took the escalator down to the ground level so he could leave the hotel. And as he went, one of these US reporters, a woman, was allowed to get very close to him, very close. No other reporter is visibly as close as that. That meant she, in my interpretation, was allowed by the State Department security people to get so close. She then called out the question again about Russia assisting Iran to kill US CIA agents and US troops. for the previous 48 hours, Reuters and other media have been running the story that the US is investigating the role of Russian intelligence, satellite intelligence, and drone technology linked to satellite intelligence for high precision targeting that attacked the CIA station in Riyadh in March. There's no news there. That was already reported, but the so-called investigation is only coming out July 21, 22, and 23. Now, why is this significant? On the Russian side, it's clear that what Lavrov said was what he said the day before, and it's repeated more or less in Diplo speak in the communique. He said, and let's imagine Rubio says, we are here to discuss the fact that our intelligence tells us, the US side, that you are assisting the Iranians to kill our people, CIA agents at secret locations and US troops. And we won't tolerate this. My own view is that's what Rubio said. Lavrov makes it clear what he replied. He said, I'm instructed by my president to tell you that you have been assisting in Ukrainian drone attacks on the Russian hinterland, on oil refineries, on shipping, on ports, and in the most recent 2 or 3 days, on retail goods warehouses in the Moscow area, in Kazan, and other places. The equivalent of the Russian equivalent of an Amazon warehouse. It's crucial to the middle class of Russians who buy through online and internet. And they've been killing, these raids, dozens of civilians, Russian civilians. So for Rubio's attack and warning to the Russians, Russia replied, we know you're doing it to us, and it's got to stop. At that point, there was no point, you can imagine, and we can discuss it. You can imagine what was left to say. They then must have gotten up and left. I'm guessing, I need to emphasize, I'm guessing for the detail, but the circumstantial evidence is also reinforced by who was sitting on Rubio's right. It was the US ambassador to India, of all places, Sergio Gor. That's not his real name. His name is Gorokhovsky. He was born in Tashkent of Soviet Union, Russian-speaking Jewish parents who moved to the United States. Gor changed his name. The family changed their name. He is but nothing more than the US ambassador to India. There's no reason why a US ambassador to India would be at that meeting unless he was the private interpreter of Rubio, the private interpreter for Russian, if the Russians chose to use Russian rather than English. That's the only reason I can think of, because he was seated in protocol place, outranking Miss Hooker, I can't remember this woman's first name, who is the fourth ranking State Department official under Rubio. She is far outranks Gor, and she should have been sitting next to Rubio, but she doesn't speak Russian. Gor does. So let's just put it this in a nutshell. We have circumstantial evidence of a very urgent meeting called by the Americans, responded to in kind by the Russians, whose subject was indicated by reporters who made their questions into statements, which Rubio then refers to in his press conference. This is very important for Russian reasons and American reasons. I'll just quickly summarize both. The Russian reason is that there's been a sharp debate, and I think we talked about it last time, within Russian decision-making circles within the media over how President Putin should respond to and retaliate against the escalation of US, Ukrainian, NATO drone warfare on the Russian hinterland, on Russian shipping in Sea of Azov, on the Black Sea against oil and gas cargoes, but not only those. coal carriers, wheat carriers have all been affected. What would President Putin do? He said that his response would be mirror, meaning tit for tat, symmetrical. But, said Putin, we will do it more powerfully. That's been criticized as insufficient. It's been criticized as a strategic mistake, criticized for allowing the US, NATO, Ukrainian side to keep the initiative and to maintain the escalation pressure, and that's affecting internal support for President Putin. That's the context in which this now must be understood and interpreted. If it's the case, and there's no doubt that high precision, high targeting competence of the Iranian drone attacks back in March, yes, but more recently, also yes. If that's the Russian response, then we've come to a very important, significant, and highly dangerous cliff edge. The Russian side is now saying, don't do that to us. You're killing our people outside the Ukrainian battlefield. If you continue, we continue. That's, to put it in a nutshell, the way it looks on the Russian side. And it counters something we talked about, Martin talked about before our last outing, and that is the Russian advocacy of going nuclear, of attacking outside the Ukrainian battlefield, but attacking with Oreshnik conventionally armed missiles or Oreshnik nuclear armed missiles at drone manufacturing plants in Berlin and wherever else in Europe they are, which includes the UK and some of the Baltic states. Now, this is clearly not what's going to happen, but the question has been put to President Putin behind closed doors. We, the Russian side, have to regain the initiative. We have to regain escalation control. We are not deterring the adversary. He's escalating against us. What are you going to do about it, Mr. President? That's the Russian context. On the US context side, we're in the last weeks, as you understand, or last months, of the midterm election campaign. My own view, Martin, please come in and correct me, is that the Republican Party will not do as badly in either house as being predicted. They may hang on to the Senate by a couple of seats. They will lose the House, but by less than 10 seats. Less than 10 seats in the House of Representatives is easy for a sitting president to manipulate. And therefore the pressure has been lessening. But, and it's a huge but, the combination of the kind of inflation and gas price and consumer pocket assaults which President Trump's escalation against Iran has triggered, the closure of Hormuz, the damage to Bab el-Mandab as a gateway to the Saudi oil movement, all of that represents one part of what kills an incumbent president at election time: rising price, inflation. The other killer of an incumbent president at election time is blood, body bags, casualties. LBJ suffered it, Martin, you and I remember it, in 1968, when LBJ basically dropped out of the race. You can't face rising inflation and rising casualties at the same time. Now, the Trump administration has been doing a pretty good job so far in hiding the casualties. As best I can tell, and you have to look at social media and all sorts of sources to figure it out. But there are ways of figuring it out. The casualties since July 20 are based on what people spot as the incoming Medevac aircraft landing at Andrews Air Force Base, and then being met by a Medevac bus and several Medevac ambulances, each of whose capacities are well known. based on people spotting these things at the airfield and then along the road and photographed them, there appear to have been, since July 20, 154 casualties, 90 wounded, 64 killed. Now, the death toll may be higher because the bodies don't come in on medevac aircraft. They can come in and not be seen. There's no way of telling at the moment. However, there's no doubt that the level of casualty is steadily rising now, and it can't be hidden. So I interpret from the US side that the White House electoral technicians have worked out and told Rubio, who's National Security Advisor, Trump, Stephen Miller, and others, look, we have to be prepared for casualty rates to become an election issue, as small as they are relatively speaking to the other wars. Trump has tweeted this over the last few days I've seen. He said, look at my performance compared to Korea, compared to Vietnam, etc. His numbers are obviously little, but a rising number and a failure to hide becomes a serious political liability. So what have they done? They've manufactured the alibi. It's not us fighting our war with Iran. It's the Russians. And so they've taken the warning to Lavrov, and this was the result. And all of that happened on Thursday morning in Manila. And now we have to catch up with it and its meaning.
Wow. Okay. It's incredible. I mean, is this on the mainstream media? The analysis is very persuasive. Um, so come here, folks, for the latest. I was just got back from the UK, and there's no sense of a crisis. And I'm writing a Substack article about the spirit of 1914. People
Precisely.
are comfortable. Nobody, if you go to the bookshops, it's all the sort of established names, the Simon Jenkins and the Max Hastings writing their blockbuster books. And they're living in a bubble, in my view, and and our podcasts is small in this geopolitics world, but we're still a name, sort of emerging name, and we're talking about these in a couple of other podcasts, and we feel like Cassandras because this is going to
Exactly.
sweep London up in a fireball, and there they are having their drinks on the banks of the River Thames and well-paid middle-class jobs like chartered surveyor and so on. You think, how can they survive anyway in a world where the Chinese steamroller, manufacturing steamrollers, everything? But there's very low awareness. So anyway, I'm just giving a plug to our podcast. I don't know, Martin, what do you think? Because so what's going to happen? Do you think that they're going to go public and blame the Russians and use that as an electoral possible winning thing? And obviously embarrassing the Russians is going to put huge pressure with public opinion, perhaps calling for more urgent measures on the Russians. In other words, it's not going to be a proxy war conducted by diplomats and the militaries anymore, where they both know the escalation dangers, but they're unleashing it on public opinion. And who knows where that's going to go next?
I think that these are acts of desperation and panic by Trump and Rubio. I think John has nailed it as always, yet again. So often, John, how often have we danced this minuet? I wish I could disagree with you. I wish I could give one of those little arrogant mainstream superior smiles you and I know so well and say, oh, it's just those two white-haired old fools again, playing at being Jeremiah, this, that, and the other. But you're always right. And I'm too often right for comfort as well. And I'm always right when I agree with you.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there are several other points I'd simply add, which I think simply add more weight to your analysis. First of all, your point about the need to have the U.S. ambassador of all places, India, there simply as a translator. This is very significant for a very revealing reason. You mentioned Assistant Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Alison Hooker. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Hooker is a very able lady. There are many people who served under the State Department under both Biden and Trump and especially Trump's personal Laurel and Hardy team of Kushner and Witkoff, who, as diplomats, are simply beneath contempt. They're simply totally inept. Ms. Hooker is not like that. She is a serious professional. And she's a very able and intelligent, responsible lady. But she is not a Russia expert, not remotely. She is a Northeast Asia expert, focusing on, of all things, on North Korea. Russia, to some degree, comes into her purview, but only really as a secondary or even tertiary source of interest. What does this tell us? It tells us the same story that you have seen firsthand for a decade at least, and I think probably twice as long in Moscow, about the decay of the American press corps in Moscow. For generations through the Cold War and even after the Cold War, the United States saw the Soviet Union and then Russia as a prime threat, as a potential source of global instability. They took the Soviet Union and Russia seriously. They sent their best people, both as journalists and also as diplomats, like, for example, Thomas Graham, to be either ambassadors or top-level people and counselors. Chip Boland took that route. George Kennan was sent on that route. This was the case for half a century. It's not true anymore, as you well know, John, hasn't been for a while. They don't have expertise in. They don't listen to you. They don't listen to you. And if they listen to you, they get better political intelligence than they would get from entire resources of the State Department and the CIA combined. Though, of course, those bars, as we both know, are set very low at the moment. So that's a very key point about having the ambassador Ambassador Gor in on this meeting. Secondly, and a very crucial point, what Secretary Lavrov shot back at, an interesting phrase, shot back at Secretary Rubio, is something I've been waiting for the Russians to say for ages, and I've been yelling and kicking and screaming, not just alone, but dozens of us have been, and nobody in the State Department or the Washington Post or the New York Times or PBS listens to us, of course. And it's simply this: feeling so wonderfully virtuous about arming Ukraine to the teeth to kill Russian soldiers and openly boasting about killing Russian soldiers, as the late, and he should be unlamented, Senator Lindsey Graham repeatedly did, and as other senators like Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut also endlessly does. They do it in the north from Connecticut, they do it from the south like Graham did from South Carolina. It's the same disgusting story. But if you gloat openly about being so brilliant and cunning and clever to arm Ukrainians to kill Russians, why are you so shocked and outraged if the Russians start playing the same game with Iran against US troops? By boasting of killing Ukrainians, you are dooming American soldiers to die as well as cannon fodder on the other side, because there will be retaliation. There will be, as you said, a further ratcheting up. So what you, I actually see one very cautious source of hope here, though I don't think President Trump or Secretary Rubio, who I've spoken very positively about in different contexts, but I don't think that they have either of them have chosen any kind of decent staff at the National Security Council, in the White House, or in the State Department to study Russia carefully. They certainly don't understand the Middle East at all. They have all these childish little neocons prancing around in Washington, beating their own puny, pathetic little chests about how macho and tough and realistic and determined they are. Contemptible. And they have so many first-class people like Colonel Larry Johnson, who we've had on the show, Colonel Doug McGregor, Colonel Dan Davis, serious men who know the Middle East backwards, Colonel G.I. Wilson. The list is long and impressive. Colonel Earl Rasmussen, ex-Marines, ex-Army people who've served on the ground in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in previous wars, who caution understanding, who caution, and they don't listen to any of them, just as they won't listen to us. But what the Russians are telling them is actually bouncing again back their own beloved American theories back at them. Because back in the Vietnam War, what did we have on the American side? We had Herman Kahn and Robert McNamara, and you will remember it well, John, you are now old enough to do so, the theory of phased escalation. We don't fight wars to win. We don't fight wars even to intimidate other people or to establish very limited specific goals. No, we sacrifice the lives of our brave fighting soldiers to make points, to signal a phrase and a cliche that the vile Robert McNamara, as SecDef, Secretary of Defense, was particularly fond of. Well, the irony is now President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov are turning that very concept back against the Americans. They are saying, if you can edge up against us and think you are pressuring and intimidating us, we can outplay you at this particular poker table. We have more chips to play than you do. We are going to play your game against you and see how you like it. We want you to stop, and the only way to get you to stop, we belatedly realize, is to intimidate you. And that's what they are doing. Now, according to the Hans Morgenthau realist theory of foreign relations, which in general I've a general sympathy for, though again, as you know, not being an American, neither am I, neither is Pele, we don't have the blind American passion of American intellectuals for simplistic, silly ideas from other intellectuals taken to a ridiculous degree. You have to live in every policy, as Henry Kissinger understood, as Bismarck understood, with common sense and restraint, and know when to back down and make U-turns. And Americans don't have that. They simply think, oh, let's go back to what Morgenthau said about this, or what some other bloody theorists said about that. You have to deal with people and situations as they are and as they change. And here, what needs to be done is what you have just advocated and warned about. The Russians are sending a warning. And the way I interpret what you have said, and please correct me if you take it differently, but how I interpret it, as you said, is Putin is walking the same tightrope that you have pointed out and warned to us repeatedly he has walked before. He is actually the least extreme of the people in the Russian leadership at the moment. He is under intense pressure from both the foreign ministry people and his military people to escalate far more radically. He is escalating, but he is escalating in incremental ways that the West has boasted about using for 50 or 60 years, and saying, I'm talking to you in your own language. Now will you hear me? Now will you listen? Now will you rein in your side before it is too late? Because as you say, John, we are very much on the edge of the cliff, and it can very soon be too late. Is that a reasonable assessment?
It is indeed a reasonable assessment, yes. And until this meeting, and yes, I hope I've the circumstantial evidence right. You've heard me be especially critical, not my opinion so much as reporting the way in which a whole swathe of Ukrainian experts in Moscow, the general staff, the intelligence services, Ukrainian opposition figures like Oleg Sarov in Crimea, my family, my friends' families spread out all over Russia, everybody, particularly because the opinion polls show this, particularly if you're male, well-educated, live in Moscow, and are over the age of 50, roughly speaking, you are dismayed by the president's performance and favor escalation to recover Russian initiative. There's no point in President Putin lecturing the Russian people, as he does, on the way in which the Russian army is valiantly moving westward. I'm not disputing the valor. I'm not disputing the movement westward. What I am saying is the other side has come up with escalations behind the lines, so to speak, developing a hinterland front, which damages Russian pockets during holiday and driving season, during an election campaign. We have elections September 18 to 20. And these are serious factors, calling on the president to address Russian people without saying things they don't believe. The president has, in fact, been talking against common sense for most Russians on the domestic economy. There is no doubt among all Russians I know, including the economic experts in the State Duma, that the Russian economy is in recession. It therefore doesn't make sense for the president to say, "Good afternoon, colleagues." He did this 2 days ago, as he addresses the economic policymakers and says, well, our national GDP grew by 0.3%. And it grew for the first 5 months. 0.3 is in May, and 0.2 is growth for the first 5 months. And we're looking to improve on that. Most people don't believe it. And it's a serious failure that President Putin has himself not displayed before, that he's talking nonsense to the public that no longer believes what he says. That's a definition of nonsense. Don't tell people what they know to be untrue, and you don't do it at election time. Now, he's just, within the last couple of hours, forced the central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, to cut the key rate by another 25 basis points. This is the high interest rate policy that Nabiullina has been pushing against inflation has triggered recession. And we have recession, whatever the government's GDP numbers are. The central bank's numbers are somewhat different, but there's no doubt Nabiullina sees both inflation and recession. She's just lowered the key rate, which President Putin virtually ordered her to do. And she replied, she wasn't going to do it because the inflationary expectations are going up. The key rate should go up. No, it's come down from 14.25% to 14%. I mention all of these things because Russian voters are now much more disturbed by both the prospect of war, of an escalation which would cost more Russian lives. And on that score, Russian support for President Putin is high because he's believed to be somebody who will save Russian lives, who's conservative in any form of military adventure. And that's particularly supported by Russian women voters and the young, because the young know that if we face mobilization, we, the Russian side, face mobilization after the election, they will be called to fight and they will die. So there are these internal pressures that have been causing serious question marks for President Putin's competence. I believe this meeting is an indication that Putin has had to give up the trust in Trump theory.
Yes. Yes.
That's reflected in these negotiations with Witkoff and Kushner, whose arrival in Moscow is not being confirmed, explicitly not being confirmed, again, every couple of days. They're not being invited. They won't be announced to have been disinvited, but they won't be invited. Second, President Putin's been compelled to send Lavrov to answer the American charge. Third, President Putin is not a pro-Iranian figure. His secret discussions of Iranians, which I've published with the last President Bush and others, shows that he's not liked the Iranian officials he's met over the last 20 years. He's a Westerner. He's also pro-Israel. He's the most pro-Zionist president, individual in Moscow. All of those things have bred mutual suspicion, reciprocal distrust between elements on the Iranian side, elements on the Russian side, particularly Putin. He's been forced now to do exactly what the Americans are complaining of in defense of Russia, in defense of his own.
John, we've got 1 minute left, so I've got to intervene there. Do you
Yeah,
think the Russians are going to are use so they'll escalate against the US, cause casualties, maybe cause the Americans to dial back their support of attacks on civilian warehouses in Moscow? Do you think that staves off the need for the Russians to attack Western drone factories in London and Berlin?
I don't believe there will be such an attack, Ellie.
Okay.
I think that that's a deception operation, if you don't mind me saying so. We don't have time to go into it. On the part of those Russians and those supporters in the West, including John Mearsheimer, who seem to support such a move. No, that's the creation of an extreme point of view, which President Putin has no intention of
I
following, and
agree.
neither does the general staff.
Thank you. Okay, we'll leave it there, John, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much. People listen to this podcast and they get 10 more times more information than reading the pages of the Times of London and
Here,
the
here.
Telegraph. Thank you
Well,
so
listening
much.
to you, sir.